Good morning and welcome everybody. We're going to start in just a few moments here with the Apologetics class. So if you're here for that, we'll get started, as I say, just in a few seconds here as we'll start with a prayer when things kind of quiet down a bit. If they ever do. Uh-oh. Okay, let's see if we can get started then. We have a lot of ground to cover today. We're going into a new unit in our Apologetics series, which is a 7-part series. Today we're on challenge number 5 to the Christian faith. And as it says on your handout, the challenge here has to do with evolution. Does evolution really show that you don't really need a creator? That'll be the subject today, and a very important one. And we'll cover that next week as well. I'll explain what we're going to do next week. But anyway, good to have you here after the Thanksgiving break here and as we continue with our series. So blessings and welcome to all. And now that it's quiet, let's begin with a prayer. Lord God, once again, we thank you for this day. We thank you for your word. We thank you for your presence. We thank you for the message of Advent and Christmas, that you have made your presence known so personally among us. Lord, may we personally be involved this day in hearing about your world and your word, that we may be more effective witnesses for you. In Jesus' name, amen. When it comes to the whole matter of evolution, I suspect that there are many different outlooks in this room and many different feelings about how important or unimportant this topic may be. I think for some of you it may be something that you don't think about that much or think of as being that important, whereas for others of you, it's one of the most crucial issues that we can deal with. And I suspect today that the one thing I can be certain of is that not everybody is going to agree with everything that is said today, although for the most part, I'm really going to be seeking those points on which I feel we can very strongly agree. And maybe I should start out with a bit of a personal disclosure, and that is that for most of my life, I did not think very much about evolution in terms of the Christian faith anyway. Something I pretty much accepted. I thought things fit pretty clearly. I remember, and it's funny that I do remember this, because I don't remember that much else about my confirmation class when I was an 8th grade student. I remember the question came up. It was dealt with by our pastor, and I remember what he said. But for me, it wasn't that big an issue. It was actually somewhat on the boring side. But in the last decade or so, and only about the last decade, I have really been challenging my own views in this regard. First of all, because I have become aware, as never before, of some tremendous scientific challenges to the whole idea of evolution. Although in many circles, you're not going to hear about them. They're just not going to be publicized. Let me quote something to that effect by a philosopher of science who has a couple of science advanced degrees himself, Stephen Meyer. In his book, and it has a kind of a telltale title, it's a very thick book, and I have read through it, called Darwin's Doubt. And he says in that book, regarding the status of evolution and its teaching, he says, "Rarely has there been such a great disparity between the popular perception of a theory and its actual standing in the relevant peer-reviewed scientific literature." He says, "Evolutionary biologists will acknowledge problems to each other in scientific settings that they will deny or minimize in public, lest they aid and abet the dread creationists." And I must say, from personal experience, talking to a scientist who lives in this area, not in Longmont, but in this area, I asked him a couple of years ago about what he felt was the status of this whole doctrine of evolution. And he said, boy, a lot of interesting stuff is going on behind the scenes when scientists gather, but it's really hush hush. So I suspect that there is a lot more skepticism in the scientific community about the validity of Darwinism and then gets let on in the public. As a matter of fact, I checked it out. There's a website, I think the title of the website is Descent from Darwin. Anyway, there are about hundreds at least, I think probably close to 1,000 now, scientists, most of whom have PhDs, who disagree with what has been taught so fully, particularly shortly after Darwin wrote his major work in 1859. That's when he wrote On the Origin of Species. His other one, Descent of Man, was, as I recall, around 1871. But anyway, it's been very popularly taught, but behind the scenes, there are real questions. So that began to make me say, hey, I've got to look at this more thoroughly. I should have taken more time in my years of active ministry to look at this issue. So the first reason is the scientific dissent that I'm seeing. The second issue is that as I read a lot of this, I'm coming to the conclusion there is a real conflict between the traditional concept, and I try to use that term advisedly, of evolution and Christianity. I'm not really sure they're compatible. When you try to see how they fit together, I think it's really something like comparing apples and orangutans. I mean, it just doesn't quite fit the way that I thought they would fit. And what I say here in the handout is this, that whether or not you see any compatibility between Darwin's theory of evolution and the Christian understanding of a creator, the fact remains that virtually every atheist in the world doesn't see any compatibility, doesn't see them mixing. And also, it's quite a fact, I'll give you several things to back up these statements, but quite essential to note that countless people have departed from the Christian faith because of what they have been taught about evolution, or at least, at the very least, have tried to justify their departure on that basis. An example, Lee Strobel, I think an excellent apologist. I love his approach and what he does in his books. In his work called Case for a Creator, says this: the seeds of my atheism were sown as a youngster when religious authorities seemed unwilling or unable to help me get answers to my questions about God. And now, this is the statement I'm really getting at. My disbelief flowered after discovering that Darwinism displaces the need for a deity. I'm going to say that again because that's parallel. I had written the title of this before I read that, but it's certainly parallel to it. He said, my disbelief flowered after discovering that Darwinism displaces the need for a deity. You know, he was an agnostic or atheist for years and years. And that's the very specific challenge that we're dealing with today, just phrasing it a little bit differently from the way that Strobel writes it. Evolution shows that there's no need for a creator. What's the evidence of that? Well, I think of Michael Ruse. I think you pronounce it that way. I haven't heard it pronounced, but I've just read the name several times, R-U-S-E, who's a leading evolutionist, wrote in the year 2000, evolution is a full-fledged alternative to Christianity. Not compatible, but an alternative. Richard Dawkins is probably the most prominent atheist in the world these days, and he writes that Darwinian evolution makes it almost certain that there is no God. And very famously, Dawkins has said that evolution allowed him to become an intellectually fulfilled atheist. Or I think of a professor at Tufts University, Daniel Dennett, I think his name is, it's spelled just like Bennett, only with a D, praises Darwinism as what he calls a universal acid that destroys just about every traditional concept of religion and morality. Or in my own life, the one exception to the rule of kind of smooth sailing regarding evolution most of my life was back in my freshman year in college when we were assigned a newly written book at that time by a guy named George Gaylord Simpson, an evolutionary biologist, in a book called The Meaning of Evolution. And this statement just hit me between the eyes. He says, man is the result of a purposeless and natural process that did not have him in mind. He was not planned. And if you wonder the impact that that book had on young people in a Christian school, probably my best friend in the freshman year came to that school with a lot of thought about maybe going into the ministry someday. He left it after 1 year, an agnostic, which he has remained the rest of his life. And nothing, as I recall our conversations, affected him more than that statement about evolution. We were not planned. A couple more pieces of evidence, because I want to try to convey how important this topic is. And even though I'm still struggling with it to some extent, it's absolutely crucial that we all struggle with it, because William Provine, a pretty outstanding atheist, so to speak, of Cornell, an evolutionary biologist, says, if Darwinism is true, then there are 5 inseparable conclusions. There's no evidence for God. There's no life after death. There's no absolute foundation for right and wrong. There's no ultimate meaning for life. And people don't really have free will. And Provine calls Darwinism the greatest engine of atheism ever invented. Or from the Christian perspective, an evangelist named Mark Cahill goes around and talks a lot with high school students and with college students and speaks on campuses. And he says this, he says, in my time on those campuses, the number one answer I get for there not being a God, so that then I don't have to believe it, is evolution. Richard Dawkins, I mentioned him, such a prominent atheist, says, and this sounds strange for an atheist, the evangelicals are really right on this one in the sense that they recognize there's a deep incompatibility between Christianity and evolution. So have I made my point? You may think, well, evolution's no problem. What's Bruce getting so riled up about? Just his crotchety old age or something here. But my point is, many people do say evolution shows that there doesn't need to be a creator. Okay, let's go into this and see what we can begin to say about this. First of all, it's pretty important how you define the terms, which is always important in just about any kind of concern. And it's extremely important to realize that there's a real double use, at least, if not multiple use, of the term evolution or evolve. In many cases, when people use it, what they really mean is change over time. In that case, there need be no problem on any level, it seems to me, as to how the word is used. But if evolution is, which it certainly is for many people, a challenge to faith, we need to know why is it a challenge, and because it's described as purposeless and directionless. So doesn't that, if that's how you define it, there's no purpose. We're not here as any planned being, as said George Gaylord Simpson. In that case, I think we can all see the conflict. I have this kind of mania almost for looking at words and how they're used, and I'm really struck by the way, I'll try to simplify this as much as I can, but the way I've seen the word evolve used in at least a double meaning in our time. Let me give you an example. Suppose I were to say these 2 sentences. Number 1, all of life evolved from a common ancestor by natural selection acting on random mutations. Okay, you got that? Secondly, how about a sentence like this? The International Red Cross began with a small committee in Geneva, Switzerland, in 1863, and then evolved into a worldwide organization that has helped millions of people. Do you sense what's going on here? There's a logical fallacy. I'll explain a little bit more in a moment, but it's called equivocation, where one of the things that gets confusing is that words are used in very different ways, but sometimes one is used to argue in favor of the other when you're talking about different things. Okay, I know this is abstract. Let me give you 2 examples close to home from no less a source than the Longmont Times Call. A letter 1 month ago today, November 5th, talked about the organization called HOPE. I believe it stands for Homeless Outreach Providing Encouragement, HOPE. And this is the letter verbatim as it appeared, a sentence from it. He said, HOPE has been working with people experiencing homelessness in Longmont since 2007. We have evolved many times to meet the changing needs of a homeless community. Okay, fine. I don't think anybody has a problem with that. But did you know, according to a July article in the Times Call, that artificial turf has also evolved. So help me, that's the name of an article. Artificial turf and how it has evolved. And it went something like this in the part that I wrote down. We're getting more proficient at making artificial things appear like the real thing. Artificial grass has improved over time, too. And so my concern, as you look at these words again, is that the mind can kind of drift unthinkingly, unconsciously, from one to the other. I mean, imagine this. There's even a very formal logical argument that is an objection to it, called equivocation, and I kind of referred to it a minute ago. That words will be used in different ways. One is used, though, to argue for the other. Let me try to give you a personal example, just an example off the top of my head, or something I've jotted down very recently here. Something like this. Suppose somebody's talking to you and they say, well, look, we all know that organizations evolve all the time to fit changing needs, and products like artificial turf can evolve and get better, and whole societies evolve. We don't have the same kind of government exactly that we did in 1789. I mean, there are new opportunities, new things that happen. Things evolve all the time. So what kind of problem do you have with the evolution of the beings in this world that Charles Darwin talks about? See, the one is not the same word as the other, but they're used as though they were. Again, there's a very formal, and I've never been trained really in formal logic, but I've heard and read about this, called equivocation, where one, which I tried to illustrate just there, one is used to argue for the other, but they're not the same word, even if they're spelled exactly the same, and they sound alike. Okay, other definitions, I need to move on here, but that's just kind of something that I'm passionately interested in as to how our use of words can affect our thinking. We need to keep very much in mind another distinction, and it does have to do with definitions and the use of words. The term microevolution and the term macroevolution. And as I say in the handout, microevolution refers to the fact that many animals and plants have changed over the years, change over time, often adapting to changes in climate. And for example, the classical example of the beak sizes among the Galapagos finches that Darwin pointed out, which vary according to changing rainfall, etc. Another example of that, or at least a close analogy, is the fact that we all know about artificial selection, quote unquote. It's called the selective breeding of animals. And there are many, many, many other examples of microevolution, small changes over time. I don't know anybody who doesn't accept that. But there's a slippery jump here to what is better described as macroevolution, at least there was in Darwin's mind, where macroevolution says that new species and classes of animals and plants appear as the result of natural selection acting on random mutations. At least that's the way it got phrased after they call it the Darwinian synthesis of the 1930s. Natural selection acting on random mutations, with everything stemming ultimately from a common ancestor. That was very crucial in Darwin's argument. His only illustration in Origin of Species is the tree of life, where everything supposedly comes from the same ancestors. So to Darwin, small microevolution steps eventually lead to macroevolution and the development of brand new species. There's also a distinction we can make theologically. I wouldn't make too much of this because the word evolution is not used a whole lot, but whenever you see an ism, it usually refers to something that becomes an organizing principle of life almost. It's something all-encompassing, and one can easily slide into the other, and you don't always know, talking with a person, oh yeah, I accept evolution, but for somebody else saying that, it might be the centerpiece of a whole philosophy. An example of something that happened, 26 years ago now, was that 1995 statement that I talk about in the handout by the National Association of Biological Teachers that said that human beings are nothing but the products of an unsupervised, impersonal, unpredictable, and natural process, but was revised later when some people pointed out that's philosophy, not science. That's theology. And yet many people, again, can confuse these terms. That's why I'm hitting the whole business of definitions so hard. C.S. Lewis talked about evolutionism. Today, the terms used much more are that basically Darwinism is often used to buttress a worldview of philosophical naturalism, that only natural causes are real, only matter and energy are real. And again, this can be called naturalism, it can be called materialism. One example of that and how evolutionism becomes a driving, passionate force happens to be, according to a book I read, I've not seen it personally, it happens to be that somewhere in this country there is a huge billboard, according to this book that I read, that has a great big sign. So imagine yourself driving along an interstate and you see these words all of a sudden on this billboard. Praise Darwin, evolve beyond belief. Think about that. Evolve, won't you? Beyond, get rid of that Christian belief. Improve yourself here. So, what are the difficulties when you see that evolution becomes evolutionism? When you see something like praise Darwin, get rid of Christianity. But as I said, I have been struck in the past decade or maybe 15 years about many, many scientific challenges that have been coming, especially since the development of the electron microscope, for example, which I think was somewhere around the 1930s, 20s, 30s, 40s. And I'll mention some of these, but not as much as we'll get in. I might as well mention it right now, because I'll be referring to this a number of times. I've got a completely different kind of thing that I'm going to suggest we do next week. A DVD at home that aside from my personal DVDs of childhood memories and so forth, I think is my number one out of about the 100 or so that I have. This one is called Unlocking the Mystery of Life. And you're going to see a lot of contemporary scientists and philosophers of scientists. One who totally changed his mind on this, from a guy who had no problem in the past with life evolving from non-life, and now he's totally changed his mind. And all kinds of marvelous graphics, if you're at all familiar with the Illustra company. They do a fantastic job of showing the very up-close and incredible workings of, for example, DNA in the cells. This is a little over 60 minutes, by the way, so we're going to get started next week, maybe a minute or two early. But it is really worth seeing. I just find, when I saw those images, I said to myself, I've got to share these with people. They are really incredible. It was suggested to me by a scientist locally who found that, I think, as striking as I did. Anyway, as a result of a lot of that and some of the thinking that I've been trying to do and some of the reading I've done, I just realized there are a lot of things that evolutionism, as it's commonly seen in terms of neo-Darwinism, basically says that everything came from nothing. I mean, you've got to deal with how can nothing plus no one produce everything? Does that sound like a sensible mathematical statement? Nothing plus no one yields everything in this incredible universe, this amazing far-flung universe. But it's still stated in some cases. Or then, closely related to that, how did life come from non-life? Well, you know, they've created life in a test tube now, don't you know? No, that particular experiment that's usually referred to has been debunked entirely. Even its proponent, I mean, the person who did it, has rejected it as a final explanation of anything. I'm referring to the famous Miller-Urey experiment of 1953. Stanley Miller was a doctoral student at the University of Chicago, and Harold Urey was his advisor. And supposedly he was able to create these things that turned out to be, you know, amino acids from the non-living things. Well, all kinds of things have been pointed out. I won't try to, I think it's going to be referred to next week, but there'll be stuff like this in that DVD next week of a similar kind, if not this one specifically, where it just doesn't work. And again, it's scientists saying, you got the wrong elements in the atmosphere and blah, 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 just doesn't work. So that's another challenge. Or I am so struck by the whole miracle of human consciousness. And I think I meant to change it, and somehow they changed it. I've forgotten, it didn't get through. I think on your handout it still says came from soup, which has to do with what's sometimes called prebiotic soup or pond scum. And Darwin used a similar term to that, where the idea that all of life was just accidentally kind of cooked up. Bertrand Russell called it an accidental collocation of atoms from this prebiotic soup even. I mean, from this pond scum, and then eventually from a common ancestor through all these animals ends up with us. Or somebody has put it much more succinctly than that. The idea of life coming from the goo to the zoo to you. So, but just the miracle of consciousness is an incredible miracle. There are scientists who, well, I'll quote something in a moment, but as I think of Bertrand Russell talking about the accidental collocation of atoms, a little aside here, one of my crazy little illustrations, but couldn't quite resist. You know, if we're really basically nothing, I know there are a lot of subatomic particles that have been pointed out, you know, in the category of hadrons and leptrons, but let's use what most of us were taught, protons, neutrons, electrons. I mean, think of what it is. How did one of these protons or neutrons or electrons one day say, I am a proton. I'm a neutron. I mean, if it's true, it's just absolutely, I mean, suppose that's all we really are right now, just this accidental mix. What that would mean is that we're all just protons, neutrons, and electrons in motion, and yet think what's going on. These protons, neutrons, and electrons up here, I can't really call them mine because there would just be these atomic features. Protons, neutrons, and electrons here are trying to communicate with you protons, neutrons, and electrons. But my protons, neutrons, and electrons are not only aware of your protons, neutrons, and electrons, but my protons, neutrons, and electrons are trying to convince you protons, neutrons, and electrons that life is far more than protons, neutrons, and electrons. And if you can believe that, just add that we're just atoms, then more protons to you, but I can't really. I just find that literally unbelievable. And a recent poll shows 1 in 5 British atheists and over a third Canadian atheists agreed with this statement. Evolutionary processes cannot explain the existence of human consciousness. And then a similar sounding, but certainly different word, the word conscience also comes up as a major topic here. How did conscience arise under this kind of setup? And you know, the more you think of it, conscience is a really powerful fact of life. I mean, right now, my conscience would be bothering me terribly if I didn't have the decency to give you a coffee break and give you some relief from this. Okay, we have a lot of ground more to cover here. I'm going to be kind of fast because with some of the scientific things, again, I can't say strongly enough. You're going to see some graphically portrayed things next week that, wow, if you have an atheist friend and could somehow bring them over, I'd love to see how they can explain what we're going to see next week in a different way. But I can't avoid a bit of a sideline here or a side tour because I'm looking at some things that seem to really get hushed up. And one of the things that gets hushed up that's rarely taught, I mean, it's there, you can look it up, but Darwin's book that he published in 1859 actually has 21 words to it, and rarely are more than the first 10 or 11 quoted on the origin of species by means of natural selection. But as I have on the other side of your handout spelled out, look at how, we're talking about conscience now, and my point is evolution by itself can't begin to explain conscience because look at the subtitle. The preservation of, get this, favored races in the struggle for life. I do not know anything in any field, I don't know personally, I've heard a lot of fields I don't know, but I don't know anything personally that's more systemically racist than that. It's part of the whole, if you study Darwin, it's part of the whole, the preservation of favored races. Would it shock you if I told you Hitler loved that? I'm not kidding. Matter of fact, in his, I'm going to quote for it, something that probably isn't quoted very often either, from Mein Kampf. And of course, der Kampf in Deutsch means struggle or battle. Favored races in the struggle for life. Let me read word for word what Hitler wrote in the 1920s. If nature does not wish that weaker individuals should mate with the stronger, she wishes even less that a superior race should intermingle with an inferior one. Because in such cases, all her efforts, all of nature's efforts, throughout hundreds of thousands of years to establish an evolutionary higher stage of living may thus be rendered futile. Now see, notice that nature, quote unquote, and evolution, quote unquote, were Hitler's guides. He was smart enough never to say openly that he was an atheist, but what is his real religion or lack thereof? He wanted to purify and preserve the Aryan culture and appealed to the atheistic survival of the fittest ethic to do so. And I want you to hear the words of a militant anti-Christian anthropologist named Sir Arthur Keith, who writes about Hitler and evolution like this. He says, "The German Führer is an evolutionist. He has consciously sought to make the practices of Germany conform to the theory of evolution." How many of you have heard that in your history class? My big question is somebody who, as I've said many times now, just in the last decade or so has gotten really interested in this, is why all the hush-ups on this of stuff that's really relevant? By the way, speaking of hush-ups, we've all heard the John Scopes trial. The monkey trial was at like 1925 in Dayton, Tennessee. How often have you, and they even made a movie out of it, Inherit the Wind, with Spencer Tracy and so on, quite a number of decades ago. How many of you are aware, I just heard this week, so I have to pass this along. I want to have this sink in my own cranium here. How many of you have heard that the textbook, John Scopes got in trouble, of course, for teaching evolution. How many of you are aware that his textbook in his classes by a guy named Hunter was highly racist? He talked about, this author, Hunter, 5 basic races or varieties of humankind, and said that the inferior ones will surely be exterminated. And the whole eugenics movement and all the stuff that was very widely accepted at Carnegie and Rockefeller foundations and well-known scientists in the late 1800s and 1900s, and talking about the, again, to use Darwin's own term, the favored races. My, how could something fit in more awfully close with what Hitler basically lived? Now I know that what I was taught is, hey, don't blame that on Darwin, that's social Darwinism. Spencer, wasn't that the guy's name? Came along several years ago, after Darwin, and came up with a bunch of things, and so don't blame, no, it goes right back to Darwin. Darwin very strongly believed, and I won't even mention the specifics. I've got some quotes here that would knock you off your chair, and I just don't want to do it. It's going out online eventually here. But incredibly racist remarks by Darwin and his bulldog, as they call him, Thomas Huxley, just unbelievably racist. And by the way, just to add to the goo here, Darwin was also a staunch anti-feminist. He believed that women were strictly inferior. Their minds couldn't begin to grasp what the superiorly evolved male mind is able to do. Again, I really see this as integral to Darwinism. Now, if I just thought it was an accidental connection and yeah, somebody came along later, matter of fact, Darwin didn't even use the term, if I recall correctly, he didn't even use the term survival of the fittest, but Spencer did. Okay, but this stuff flows directly from him. Now, when it comes to, and I really want to allow more time for table talk, because I think it's really important for all of you to share where you stand on this. So I'm going to go fairly fast over some of this next important stuff, partly because a lot of it's going to be covered next week, and you're going to hear firsthand from the mouth of several very well-known scientists, including the first one I quote here, Michael Behe, this biochemist, who has this wonderful analogy of the mousetrap for what he calls irreducible complexity. And the reason that fits so very well is that Darwin really, and I quote this under that business of irreducible complexity, Darwin said, in The Origin of Species, if it could be demonstrated that any complex organism existed that could not possibly have been formed by numerous slight modifications, my theory would absolutely break down. And by the way, I give him a lot of credit there. That is a proper scientific approach. You need to know what would falsify my theory. So I will give him a positive check mark on that. He pointed out that, and in the fossil record, two things that would falsify his theory. Both have been shown to be highly false, but it's not admitted very much. And Michael Behe has this wonderful analogy of the mousetrap. You got to have all 5 parts together, or you don't catch a single mouse. They can't just gradually evolve where you get the base and then the thing that snaps and, and the bait and so forth. You got to have them all at once, or you have no advantage. It's just a bunch of stuff. You could shake the thing for eternity, and unless you get them together at the same time, it doesn't work. And next week, we're going to see a marvelous illustration of how he sees this in real life biology with this wonderful thing called the bacterial flagellum. It's absolutely just a mind blower. If you can look at that and say, well, yeah, this just kind of fell together over enough time, it's going to happen. You take the time and see if that'll ever happen in how many lifetimes here. Anyway, the whole business of irreducible complexity is a relative, at least the concept of it, that Behe really has popularized, really hits. The blood clots. I didn't realize, I never thought about, okay, you get a cut and yeah, you're going to stop bleeding. It takes, I said over a dozen, I think I read 17 different things, have to be together all at once or you die. So if by this slow process of very small changes that Darwin kept stressing, if by that you get 12 or 13 or 14 out of the 17, it doesn't do you one bit of good. People keep on dying, so they don't pass their genes along. You see how important this irreducible complexity is? Again, I know I keep plugging away at this, but I just want as many of you as possible to see how well graphically illustrated things like this can be. And you're going to say, wow, I didn't know life was that complex. I am so struck by the intricacy of life, just absolutely struck by it, especially with DNA. I mean, it is just, we have what, trillions and trillions and trillions of cells in our body, which is incredible enough when you figure that somebody figured, by the way, that counting at 1 per second, how long do you think it would take to count to 1 trillion? We hear about $1 trillion budget. You know how long it would take you? 1 per second, day and night, never sleeping? 31,000 years. I've done the math on that. It works. Haven't done the experiment, but I've done the math. Okay, fossil failures is another huge one, and he, bless his heart, I give him credit for this. He did say he was pretty well baffled by why he didn't see the fossils backing all of this up. He says, why then is not every geological formation and every stratum full of such intermediate links? Geology assuredly does not reveal any such graduated organic chain, and this perhaps is the most obvious and gravest objection which can be urged against my theory. But, you know what his out was? Yeah, we don't have them now, but we got to do more explanation. We'll find them. Exploration. No, we haven't found them. Let me give you one quick example and I'll move on. There was a Chinese paleontologist who was lecturing to scientists around the world, including a lot in the United States, saying that the recent fossil beds in his country are quite inconsistent with the Darwinian theory of evolution. Because the main thing is, if you've heard of the Cambrian explosion, they talk about that all the time. That's what this huge book, Darwin's Doubt, was really centered in, where all of a sudden, all kinds of phyla appear within relatively few years, nothing like Darwin's tree of life. And anyway, this Chinese paleontologist says that when he points out how the fossil findings in his country so contradict Darwin, scientists get mad, a lot of them. And his comeback is this. He says, in China, we can criticize Darwin, but not the government. In America, you can criticize the government, but not Darwin. But fortunately, this Chinese scientist can criticize Darwin. And I mentioned Darwin's Tree of Life here in this same chunk of material in the handout. It's worth looking up. I'm sure you could Google Cambrian explosion very easily. And then mutations, I'm not going to go into this. I'm no expert on this, but I'm told that mutations don't really add information. They take away information, and once in a while, that can actually be helpful. This horrible thing called sickle cell anemia actually helps prevent certain other kinds of conditions. And so in certain environments, people with that might survive, but it's a loss of information. It's not a gain. It's not this thing of, well, things get better and more complex and they get more intricate over time. Not at all. And then what really gets me, and again, because of time, I'm not going to go into this, but what I call fabricated frauds. Now, let me say, by way of prelude here, every endeavor in human history has been full of frauds and hoaxes. Sadly enough, certainly even in the ministry. Some of the major icons of evolution, as one author put it, however, and I point out 4 of them here, have generally not been retracted. You get things like, for example, the famous German Darwinist Ernst Haeckel in the 1860s. Have you ever heard the phrase, ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny, where you see these embryos, and yeah, see, we were all just the same in the stage of these lower animals. They're just like human embryos in their early stage. No, it was faked. But it isn't very often retracted as being faked. Peppered moths in England, I won't even go into that, but this whole thing of when the Industrial Revolution came along and the skies got polluted, then the darker moths were an advantage because they could perch on the trees, and with their dark background and the very dark atmosphere, their predators couldn't see them, and the light-colored ones got eaten and so forth. Only problem was they don't perch on trees. And the pictures that you see, they were glued there or pasted there. Or there was the Piltdown hoax. Piltdown, an area south of London, 1912, an amateur geologist showed a partial skull reputed to be a human ancestor up to 1 million years old. Only problem was the jawbone was from an orangutan, fitted with 2 fossilized chimpanzee teeth, filed down to make them look more like human teeth. Or there was the famous Nebraska man, which actually was a pig's tooth. They drew a whole man from this, even his wife. There was no female remains, and were no female remains in the area. My point is not that there are frauds. Science has this wonderful method where one of the beauties of it is you can uncover frauds. There have been frauds and hoaxes in science, but a peer-reviewed and a replicable kind of experiment will so often show the false nature of this, and then it gets pulled away, it gets renounced, it gets shown to be false. These things, at least until fairly recently, still appeared in all kinds of textbooks after they were known to be hoaxes. I want somebody to tell me why. I'm just truly asking the question. I've got my little hypothesis here. Why? Now, theistic evolution is one common stance where you try to see all the similarities you can. And this goes back a lot earlier than you might think. You might even argue that St. Augustine, who lived around 400 AD, was a theistic evolutionist. But the problem is, if you do that, watch your language. Because again, that equivocation business, if you use evolution in the sense that there's no real direction, there's no real purpose, there's no real guidance, then how can you say that God used that or did that? Was God at the mercy of what predators happened to be around and who survived and who didn't? Is that really what we want to say about our Creator God? But again, it's a widespread position, and taken with the proper... Here's an example of I would say, at least a significant kind of disclaimer. The Catholic Church has long accepted evolution. But when John Paul II reiterated that, he did make it very clear that there is a special creation of the human soul. At that point, evolution was cut into. Well, that changes the whole business. So if you want to go that route, I would say be certain that you show that difference of what you're talking about, because that breaks off the traditional definition entirely. And before we get into table talk, or some questions first if you have them, I like what Doug Rotheis writes in his book, Christian Apologetics, where he gives us one possible way of handling this, at least some things to think about. As I say here, in terms of guidance in formulating affirmations of what has happened in a God-controlled creation. Clearly, we say God created the universe ex nihilo, meaning out of nothing in Latin, not out of eternal matter, which the ancient Greek philosophers did and most other scientists did until the discoveries by Hubble and the Big Bang in 1929 and so forth, there were no pre-existing materials. God is truly creator, not just an arranger. Secondly, God created each kind. Genesis clearly talks about kind, but Genesis doesn't say that refers directly to species. That was pretty much delineated by Carl Linnaeus in the 1700s, I think it was. So you don't necessarily quote biblical kinds with species. Kind tends to be bigger than that. I don't know if it's as large as a genus, but it does, it seems to me, expand beyond the limits of what we would normally call a species. Species may change and adapt to their environment in various limited ways, given the natures God has given them. And again, I've tried to say a couple of times, no problem with microevolution. A considerable time elapsed between the creation. Now, it's always questionable how much time. Augustine, back in 400, thought the days were symbolic of longer periods of time, and some others did who were very, very, very strong conservative Christians in the 1800s and 1900s, but others insist on a 24-hour day. In any event, the order is very clear that animals came first, and also that God created human beings specially, not through some long process from the goo to the zoo to you type thing. And the first human couple was, and that's so important because Jesus refers to that, in the beginning, and Adam and Eve and so forth. We've got to uphold that. And this first human couple was specially created by God and experienced the fall, Genesis 3, in real history. And Grote says, although the exact timing of the events in Genesis 1 is left somewhat open, you can argue about that, the general sequence is clear. First, the inorganic world, then non-human life, then human life. He says, while God created each kind specifically, this doesn't rule out development within a kind, nor does it rule out extinction of species. So maybe some things I'm going to be asking you to share at Table Talk, how you would respond to the challenge of evolution. Okay, time is going. I'm really going to try to allow more time in the future for Table Talk, because when I have had occasion to sit at these tables myself in the last few weeks, I found the time went really fast, and I've been misjudging this. Even at one time we had about a half an hour, it seemed like about 5 minutes. So I think I learned I'm going to try to be a little more generous in terms of closing this thing up here sooner. Okay, so let's close with a prayer, though. Lord, you are our Creator and our Redeemer and the Spirit that leads us to your word. Thank you, Lord, that you have spoken a word, that you have planned for us, that you have a purpose for us, that you love us this very day. This is nothing to take lightly. Lord, we thank you, we praise you, and thank you for how this wonderful season of the year helps to engender that sense in our hearts. Thank you for all you've done. Grant your Spirit among us that we may be ever more faithful to what you've done for us. In Jesus' name, amen.